A reading from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 5 to 10. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said of him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications, with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and he was heard for his godly fear. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. To me, one of the great sorrows, tragedies of the Christian life is when Christians believe or feel that God is indifferent or distant and sometimes even cold. And that's usually a result of experiencing some sort of suffering or unanswered prayer in life, that being afflicted with this suffering or not having a prayer answered seems to imply that God doesn't want to or doesn't care enough to give us what we feel we need in our life. That God is way up there in heaven. Yeah, he maybe once was on earth when Jesus walked the earth and God was enfleshed before us, but no longer. God is far away again and doesn't really have compassion or understanding for what I'm living through right now. But for us as Christians, what's at the heart of knowing how God is present to us is the incarnation. It is the Son of God become flesh. And unless we truly understand what that purpose of the incarnation was and still is, then we're going to always be afflicted with that sense of indifference of God. And the letter to the Hebrews very much tries to qualify the nature of Christ's incarnation. And in the passage that we heard, that we're reflecting on today, it's pointing to Jesus as high priest. And so in the Jewish tradition, the first high priest was Moses, first designated by, not Moses, designated by Moses, Aaron, his brother, was the first high priest. And being a high priest was a hereditary gift that was passed on from generation to generation in that line of the Levites, of Aaron. And that appointment was for life. And the high priest, once a year, would go into the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem, to where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And in the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest would go, he would offer sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, for the sake of the sins of the people. Now, in this passage from the letter to the Hebrews, the author is pointing that Jesus didn't receive this as a hereditary gift. He was appointed. And he was appointed in two ways. First, "You are my beloved Son, this day I have begotten you," which for us should immediately draw our minds back to the baptism of Jesus, where the Father speaks from heaven these very words. That in baptism, Jesus accepts the appointment by God as the one who will be the high priest, who will ultimately bear the sins of the people and be the sacrifice himself as well. The second is maybe a little bit more obscure for us, that he is a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is this mysterious figure from the book of Genesis. He's only mentioned once, very briefly, in an encounter with Abram before he becomes Abraham. And it's picked up once in the Psalms and then picked up heavily in the letter to the Hebrews. And Melchizedek is identified as the king of Salem, which is translated the king of peace. And he encounters Abram's way back from freeing Lot from captivity. And Melchizedek is a priest who offers gifts of bread and wine. What's unique is the gift itself, which for our Christian minds should turn us to the Last Supper and the sacrifice that Jesus offers at the Last Supper. And then also, Melchizedek is given no lineage. Normally in the Old Testament, if somebody is of significance, especially if he's a priest, this hereditary priesthood, we should at least hear who he is the son of, right? We hear of Jesus' genealogy, but not with Melchizedek. He just appears and disappears, which is why it's picked up for Jesus as someone who is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, because it's not hereditary. It's a gift from the Father for the sake of the world. It's King of Peace. But then from this priesthood that Jesus has, kind of taking a step away from the priesthood of the Old Testament, that how is it defined? How is it described? Well, he offers prayers and supplications, loud cries and tears. This, at least in my mind, points back to the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus' great anguish and sorrow and suffering prior to being arrested and enduring his passion. And it's always struck me in the Gospel of Matthew, it's very deliberate that Jesus goes to pray, then comes back and chastises his apostles for falling asleep. And it says he goes and prays again, and then he comes back and chastises, and then he goes and prays again. We know the prayer, at least one of the prayers that he prays at that moment, Father, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And in Matthew, 3 times he goes and prays again, which to me, the way that I see that is, he goes and prays again because his prayer is yet to be answered. He hasn't been told by the Father, well, whether this cup will pass from him or the Father's will be done. That he experiences silence from his Father in that moment, which, how akin is that to sometimes our experience of prayer with God? A seeming silence in a moment of great need, of great suffering. Even in the letter to the Hebrews, it says that because he was God-fearing, he was saved from death. But we know the story of Christ. He's not saved from death unless we know the resurrection. He was saved from death ultimately, but according to the Father's will, which then leads into the next piece, which he learned obedience through what he suffered, which is one of those great verses in Scripture that is confusing and yet rich in meaning at the same time. Christ learned. When we think of the Son of God, we don't often think of, well, he had to learn something. He was God, the Son, so he must have been omniscient. But he learned something in his humanity through what he suffered. His willingness to accept the silence of the Father, to embrace his cross, and not for his own sake, but for the sake of the world, for the sake of freedom from sin. That earlier in this chapter, the author to the letter to the Hebrews reminds us that we don't have a high priest that is distant from us, but that he can sympathize with our weakness. Why? Because he learned obedience through what he suffered, willingly accepting the suffering of humanity, the suffering of the cross, but maybe even for Jesus, the suffering of accepting the limitations and weakness of humanity, letting go of the glory of his divinity for the sake of his compassion, his willingness to suffer with the human condition. Jesus very much condescended to our level. He came down to our level. So we don't have a God who is unable to experience what we experience, but he unites himself to that. And then, to me, the beautiful images of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, these conflicting, these juxtapositions of images, the cross, this great suffering, and yet as Christians we look at it and see it as a sign of victory. Or we go to the resurrection and we see this victory over sin and death. Jesus has risen from the grave, but yet he appears on Easter morning to the apostles in the upper room with the wounds in his hands and in his side and in his feet still there. The risen Lord, the victorious Lamb, still bears his wounds. And for me, that is always a reminder of how Jesus condescended to us. But now that he has ascended to the Father, he doesn't let go, he doesn't walk away from the obedience that he learned through suffering. He keeps himself tied to us forever by his incarnation. That he sympathizes with our weakness then, while he was incarnate on earth, and still as he is glorified in heaven, as the resurrected Christ bears the wounds. He is the great high priest, now the only high priest, who has offered himself as the sacrifice, not needing to offer sacrifice for this himself as well as others, but offering himself for the sins of the world. When we understand the gift of who Jesus is, of his incarnation, which then suffered and died and rose again, the Christian heart knows that God is never far away. God is always near and even maybe nearest to us when we suffer. It's the great testimony of the lives of the saints in the history of the church, who suffered greatly, the martyrs, or who suffered interiorly, bearing great burdens, but yet through that drew even nearer to God. And so the great desire of God is for us to never feel like he is very far away, that he is always near to us, maybe especially when we suffer.